friends. I know folks are still joining, but let me go ahead and call us together. I'd like to welcome you all to this weekly Wednesday gathering. My name is Lisa Zook, and I serve as the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives here at Chicago Theological Seminary. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Before we get started, just a reminder to please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. Also, we encourage you to use the chat feature to drop questions or comments in real time as we engage today. You can also use the raise your hand feature. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to navigate to both of those. There will also be opportunity to unmute yourself and speak. So if you are speaking, remember to unmute yourself. Also note that we do record our Wednesday gatherings each week, and the recordings that you can access from the CTS homepage. So I know you're going to enjoy today's service, so you might want to share it with others who can't be here today. We welcome everyone to today's gathering, and I always want to extend a special welcome to those who are new or newer to our CTS community. We do actually have a virtual guest book, so we invite you to sign that so that we might keep in touch with you. If you've been around CTS a long time, you're always welcome to sign that guest book, but especially if you're new, please take a moment to do so. My colleague Brendan will drop a link to that in the chat. Friends, we begin each week with words of gathering to help draw us into this space together. And today I am pleased to welcome Reverend Mark Winters to invite us in. Mark is an alumnus of CTS. He is a member of our Board of Trustees, and he serves as the pastor of First Congregational United Church of Christ in Naperville, Illinois. I first met Mark when I came to CTS as a student. Mark was 2 years ahead of me, and I remember well that he helped me to navigate the wild ride that is the first year of seminary, and I've always been indebted to him for that. And Mark continues to help others navigate their paths through his ministry and through his leadership at CTS. Mark, I'm so pleased to count you as a friend and to welcome you to open us this morning.
Thank you, Lisa. Back at you. It's got the mirroring thing in the video, but it's called Be the Brave One by a dear friend and colleague, Ann Cansfield, who is a pastor in New York City. She is the first woman and first openly gay chaplain of the New York City Fire Department. And I'm just going to read a little bit here. A few years ago, I had the honor of meeting a fancy bishop. One of my Catholic clergy friends graciously escorted me over to the Right Reverend and introduced me. The bishop shook my hand, squished up his already wrinkled face, turned his head slightly to the right, and looked over my shoulder so as not to make eye contact. He looked as though he had bitten into a juicy orange slice, only to discover it was actually a lemon. Perhaps this is the way he greeted all his visitors. Or maybe I gave him momentary indigestion. Protestants and Catholics don't mix very well in New York City, and I can only imagine that a queer female Protestant minister might not have sparked joy inside that particular bishop. It happens. I found it more funny than painful, but my joyful, fun-loving Catholic friend appeared heartbroken. "I'm sorry he's a turd, Anne," he said. I replied, Thomas Merton says, "A tree gives glory to God by being a tree. So maybe that's all the bishop's got, and he's giving glory to God by being a turd." "Well then, he's offering God the turtliest of turds," he said. There was something particularly heartwarming about a stately, dignified Monsignor proclaiming a bishop to be the turtliest. It wasn't mean-spirited, more factually descriptive, and it placed the three of us, me, the bishop, and the Monsignor, in the same relationship to God. It also fit with my stand-up for total depravity viewpoint quite nicely. There's a story in the Gospels that helps me understand the treeness of the tree and speaks to truth and to faith. In John's Gospel, a blind man was healed by Jesus. Some Pharisees asked the man several times how he received his sight and who he perceived the healer to be. The man answered, saying essentially, "I cannot tell you who this man Jesus is. I can only tell you that I once was blind, and now I see." This whole book is an attempt to talk about the healing power of Jesus. But like the blind man, I don't know how it all works, nor do I know what it means that Jesus died for all. All I know is that I used to be broken, and now I am more whole. Amen.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing those words with us and that writing. And I pray that in our coming together, friends, we might all find a way to be more whole together. Friends, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce you to our featured speaker today. John Pavlovitz is a writer, pastor, and activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. Over the past 6 years, his blog, Stuff That Needs to Be Said, has reached a diverse worldwide audience, recently passing the 100 million views mark. Wow. A 25-year veteran in the trenches of local church ministry, John is committed to equality, diversity, and justice, both inside and outside of faith communities. His books include A Bigger Table, Hope and Other Superpowers, Stuff That Needs to Be Said, and If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, which arrived this past September. John, I'm delighted to welcome you here with us today, and I'll turn the floor to you now.
Thank you, Lisa. It's wonderful to be with you all, my friends. I am so looking forward to our time together, and it might be a little different than some of your gatherings that you've had previously. And one of the things that I would love for you to do as we begin, if you are comfortable just leaving in the chat somewhere, where you are in life and ministry, what kind of work you're doing, what you're studying, just something about yourselves, because it's a really it's a challenge to just drop into a community and into a group of people's lives and just assume that I know what you need. So if you would mind just leaving in the chat either what you're studying, where you are in life and ministry, what your vocation happens to be, or why you're here. And we could begin there if you'll do that. And I'll make sure that I peek in there from time to time. And I'm going to invite you to share, and you can just put that in the chat, or you can unmute, you can raise your hand actually physically, or you can do it on the raise hand feature. But it's really important to me that we have a conversation and that I'm not lecturing to you, because what I know is that humanity has never been arranged in this specific configuration in the history of the planet. We have never all gathered together. And what that means is this is unprecedented. So I'm looking in here, local church pastor in Chicago suburbs, parent, spouse, transition chaplain, nonprofit director. Wonderful. Okay, I'm gonna CTS grad, parish ministry, small church, town. Great, these are flying in so fast and furious. I love it. New lay pastor in waiting. Okay, so we're all over the place, which is perfect, because in my travels, the work that I do, it's taken me, I'll share a little bit of my story as we go along, but I found myself for the past 6 or 7 years in a very virtual setting and sort of an online pastor, and getting to travel a lot. And I'm traveling when we're not in a planetary health crisis. I'm traveling all over the country, and I'm also traveling through social media. And in that time, I do quite a bit of speaking, but I also try to do a lot of listening. And I hear hundreds of stories every week. And now I don't really consider myself primarily an author or a writer or even a pastor, but a collector of stories. I have begun to see myself as a war correspondent. I get to travel into a new town and a new area, and I get into the trenches of life with people, and I say, tell me what's happening here on the ground so that I can tell the folks back home. And people give me proximity to their pain. They give me a front row seat to their stories, and I listen to the words people say, and I listen for the places that their voices shake, and I sit with them in their anger, And I leave my time with them asking, what is it that they're trying to tell people that they can't find words for? And I try to synthesize those stories into something that other people can receive. So in that spirit, as a collector of stories, as a war correspondent of sorts, I would like to open the floor as we begin and ask you what's happening here on the ground. And you could answer that any way you'd like. What is your greatest burden right now? What is the challenge to your study, to your ministry? Where are you feeling the greatest sense of tension or the greatest heaviness? If you wouldn't mind, some of you just sharing that in any way that you'd like, either in the chat or just unmute yourselves or just raise your hand. Where are you feeling the greatest tensions, the greatest burdens? What is the most challenging part of ministering right now for you? And Lisa, if you see anything, you can jump in. I'm going to look for the hands raised, and don't be shy. And I'm not afraid of awkward silences because I know this is challenging to begin this way. But if you have something that you'd like to share, even what brought you here to this gathering, because I think it's really presumptuous for someone like me. There's an arrogance to say, oh, here, I'm going to drop this wisdom to this group of people who already have a great deal of wisdom. And if you, anybody, and Lisa, just interrupt me as you get some people responding. I know there might be a delay. So I will begin, tell you a little bit about myself. This is my 25th year in local church ministry. And the question that I've been asking for the past couple of years in my life and in my ministry is, what are the greatest barriers to empathy for me and for others? And what are the antidotes to those barriers? So what hinders my love for my neighbor, and what makes my neighbors unable or unwilling to love me? And for our time together, I wanted to dwell on two wounds: the wounds of the world and the internal wounds that you sustain attending to them. I want to think about the need at this place in time in the history of the planet for generous, sacrificial healers, but the cost of being one of those healers. Quick overview of my story. I was drafted into ministry. It was not something that I intentionally chose. I was raised in Syracuse, New York, in a fairly traditional Roman Catholic family. So I say I was raised on gluten and guilt, and a lot of pasta, a lot of repentance. And in my upbringing, I had two formative stories. I had a God story, and in my God story, God was massive and made everything, and yet knew me intimately and loved me completely. And this was a God that I knew had a fierce affection for me, but also one that was always on the verge of becoming angry with me. But that God ultimately loved me. So I had a God story of that God. And then I had a family story. And in my family story, my family said that I could do anything and be anything, and they were in my corner and they were for me. And not everyone starts off with that kind of formative family story. But I had these two working stories of a God who loved me and a family who was for me. And yet, despite all that, I had a really small table. I was only around people who looked and talked and thought and believed and worshiped and loved the way that I did. And what I ended up learning, which you know, is that if you're only around people who look and talk and think and believe and worship and love the way that you do, well, your table's naturally going to be small, and you're naturally going to subside on false stories about all sorts of people. And I had a lot of false stories in my upbringing about LGBTQ people, about people of color, about poor people, and all these false stories. They caused me to live in such a way that I was a loving person, but I had a really small table of hospitality or understanding. And I always tell people that God gave me a gift in the form of the city of Philadelphia, because when I got to Philadelphia to study graphic design and illustration in college, I was suddenly immersed in diversity that I'd never been surrounded by. And I had, living in the heart of the city, I had a front row seat to poverty in a way that I never knew existed. And the gift that I was given in those moments was that my false stories were obliterated. And I got better stories about people, and I got proximity to people that I had no proximity to before. And those better stories changed me. And 10 years later, when I was surprised by entering into ministry, I tried to stay the person that I was in the city of Philadelphia as a minister. And what I found was that the church, or organized religion, or the duties of ministry often shrink your table. And one of the central scripture passages in my tradition, which has been Christianity, was Matthew chapter 9, 35 to 38. And the scripture tells us, the writer says that Jesus he's healing and he's preaching and he's teaching. And then he looks upon the crowds, and it says that he had compassion on the crowds because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And what I loved about that, and still do, is that Jesus is moved in that moment not by someone's by their conduct. He's moved by their internal turmoil. And so he's not concerned with behavior modification. He's most concerned with meeting people's needs and overcoming the tangible things that prevent people from knowing their belovedness. And so that for me is such an important thing, because I always have to ask myself, when I look at the crowds, what story do I tell myself about the crowds? And so as I think about the last 25 years and where I've been and how I've lived, and I think about you and the place where you find yourselves, a question that I often ask over and over again is, how did I end up here? How did I end up here sharing this time with you? How did I can remember being, for example, in a middle school lock-in 20 years ago, praying for God to come and take me home quickly. I asked myself, how did I end up here? Or I can remember being with a group of students in Philadelphia, and we were going to a corn maze, and we got about halfway through the corn maze, and we ended up in the middle of the field, and there's a clearing, and there's a group of chairs and a VCR and a TV, and we're all instructed to sit down, and we end up having to watch a badly produced movie with two students who are driving, and they got into an accident, and they didn't accept Jesus, and so they're going to hell. And the person there says to all my students, you need to accept Jesus to get out of this maze, essentially. And I thought, we've stumbled onto the only evangelistic corn maze in suburban Philadelphia. But I asked myself, how did I end up here? And I've asked that question too, sitting in a police station with a teenager who'd made a really horrible decision and called me before she called her parents. Or I remember thinking, how did I end up here? Or having to tell two sisters that their mother had passed away, and thinking as they walked in the room, how did I end up here? So in beautiful and really terrible ways, I've asked that question. And I think every minister, every parent, every caregiver, every spouse has had their how did I end up here moments. And I'd like to think that I ended up in many of the places that I've ended up because of compassion, because of an empathy that propelled me into places I wouldn't otherwise go, and gave me proximity to people that I would never have met any other way. And I know that's true of you, not knowing anything about your life or your ministry or your work in the world. I think that's what compassion does. It moves us out of comfort and into harm's way. And right now, you are in the process of being propelled into the turbulence of this world, into the shaking of being human that people experience. So as a loving parent and a devoted friend and a faithful caregiver and a passionate activist and a devoted minister, you are there because of a love for humanity that pushes you into the jagged, messy trenches of people's lives. You are not doing this studying, and you are not doing this work so that you can be at a distance from humanity. And I think what that love does is it causes you to spend something of yourself on behalf of someone else, to give something away for the other in whatever context you do that. And it's really important as a pastor and someone who does this work is to remind you of the subtraction of empathetic ministry and of activism, and to think about how to cultivate what I would call a lifestyle of sustainable compassion. Because this journey for 2.5 decades, for me, I have seen so many people be decimated by this work to the point that they can no longer do this work. And it's always important for me to remind you that you expiring early or burning out quickly is not the goal here. The goal is to embody your faith, your morality, your convictions in such a way that you can do this for a long period of time. And if we had time to sit one-on-one and we weren't in the awkward setting of a Zoom gathering, you would probably tell me how tired you are. And I think it's exhausting to give a damn, to be a person of compassion in a time and a place when compassion is in such great demand. Because you wake up every day and the nature of your work means you're pushing back against predatory politicians and toxic systems and corrupt legislation and human rights atrocities and acts of treason. And all this brokenness in the world, you're on the front lines of that by virtue of the work you do and the calling that each of you have. And the volume and the relentlessness of the threats can wear you out. You may not have noticed, but that's probably true for at least the people around you, if not for yourself. And what I'd love for you to think about a little bit is how much you carry as you become agents of empathy in the world. You're carrying around big picture, large systemic realities and political realities of racism and healthcare and immigration and women's health and LGBTQ rights. These are huge, big and distant issues that you're carrying. And that's a lot to be on the front lines of, but you're also carrying something else. You're carrying the individual faces and names and lives of individual people who are impacted by all of these things. And so we do this work of empathy in both systems and in stories. And you're always being asked to work in both of those avenues, in both the systems and in the stories. And in my faith tradition, I've always loved the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, because it reminds me of the breadth of what Jesus is doing in the world. So yes, Jesus is the shepherd. He's, personal caregiver. He is attentive to individual and to story, to the sheep, to the ones he sees as harassed and helpless. He is that caregiver. But not to the wolves, to the agents of power that he sees as corrupt, he is the fierce opposition. He is a holy terror. And so it's important that we understand that we are called to be both personal caregiver and status quo changer, and how difficult both of those things can be, especially because they require something different from us. And there's a personal cost to your compassion. There's a price tag to cultivating empathy in days like this when cruelty seems to be trending. And the symptoms are all over the place of this sort of cruelty sickness. You've got irritability, impatience, and physical illness, and emotional eating and addictive behavior, and the inability to be present to people who love you, and an obsession with social media, a fixation on how difficult things are. And the people that you engage with, the crowds that you experience, in whatever context you experience the crowds, there is a time for them that is of relentless urgency and profound grieving and relational fracture. And that is what makes you both so important and so vulnerable. I call it, as a student minister, that I said that I was a storm chaser. I would say, I would go toward a place that people wanted to avoid, adolescence. I would go to teenagers and go, that looks horrible, let's go there. So I chased that storm. And I would imagine, aside from your studies and aside from the communities you work in and the actual day-to-day responsibilities that you have, you probably feel the heaviness of these days. And speed and activity can tend to mask them for a little while, but if you slow down long enough and you're still long enough, the fatigue catches up to you and you can measure the toll that it's taken on you. And it's important for me that you do this from time to time, that you stop and you slow down long enough to let the fatigue catch up to you. Because this idea of compassion, it's always, I've always loved that word we translate as compassion has its root in the word bowels. That idea that our deepest emotions were housed right inside near our vital organs. And that idea, because compassion is this sentiment that we could feel so deeply witnessing someone else's pain that we could be internally disturbed to the point of sickness. Which is why it's not inaccurate to say that someone's story of suffering moves us. And I used to joke about that there's this idea that compassion is tied to the word bowels. And so compassion is a movement. And I used to say compassion is a bowel movement. And a gentleman said to me, that's because we give about people. And there's this question that has been asked. There's a phrase from the ancient tradition of Christianity, and it says that compassion is to be twisted in your bowels, seeing the suffering in the world. And what I would be honored by, if you would do me a favor and unmute or in the chat, tell me what twists you in your bowels as you do this work. What is it that disturbs you to the point of sickness? What is it that physically alters you as you endeavor to study and work and give care? Who would share with us what thing twists them in their bowels doing this work or being a person of empathy?
The couple people who have their hands raised, John.
Beautiful.
Maybe Larry.
Larry.
Yes, John, thank you. I'm not sure that I can speak to the twisted bowels, so that's a very wonderful concept. I just wanted to share with you that I'm part of a group of retired clergy here in Vermont that meet every month on a Wednesday morning. And we met last week, and one of our members, Catherine Cadeau, was really glowing about John Pavlovitz. And I had not heard of John Pavlovitz, much to my chagrin. And but then I Reflection was having a meeting last week, and they weren't, but they said next week we're having John Pavlovitz. And I thought, wow, this is a divine movement here.
Excellent.
So, and then I just recently read Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain, and I'll confess, the first time I'd read that book after all these years. I'm 89 years old. And what came through that book to me was the idea of vocation. He struggles with vocation all through his life, really. And it got me thinking about, okay, Larry, do you have a vocation now at age 89? And if so, what is it? And so I'm putting those two things together, and I'm hoping that in this contact today, I'll get some insight into what is and I have a lot of involvements. I'm not just sitting in my wheelchair, so to speak. I'm involved in a lot of things, church, and I sing. I'm part of a group that sings at bedsides of people who are dying, hospice singing group for our community here in Brattleboro. Lots of things, but that's not necessarily vocation in the sort of focus sense. So that's what I'm And that's all I'll say. I'm taking up too much time already.
Wonderful. All right, Larry, thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks so much. Lisa, you said there was another hand up to that question? Someone else?
Yeah, Marie?
Hi, Marie.
Hi there. I guess I'm going to ask a question that's not about what we're talking about.
That's totally fine.
But a thing that I struggle with is prayer. And I generally, or up until very recently, have prayed as a practice at night. And lately, that means I don't sleep too well. So I wanted you to, I'm reading your book and also your new Lenten devotional, which I'm finding very comforting. But you talk about prayer, and in the book, you're talking about losing a young family member.
Mhm.
And you say, I still pray for people to pray, and I still pray, but I try to reorient my prayers these days. I no longer believe in a supernatural Santa Claus who dispenses life and death based on the conduct or the heart of the recipients and their friends. I don't believe in a God who withholds miraculous healing or compassionate care until sufficiently begged by us to do so. I find a great comfort in that, because I also have to wonder about a God who needs, who needs piddly people to constantly praise and beg, and for me, that's not much of a God.
Right. Well, and for me, prayer changed quite a bit, about 15 years ago. And I can remember being in the middle of a prayer and doing what often many in ministry do. We've learned to pray really well. We can verbalize prayers that sound really eloquent and beautiful because we're often praying in front of people. But I wasn't. I was just using that same kind of language. And I remember just thinking, you're fraudulent right now, because these words, they're just hollow. And who are you trying to impress? And I realized that I didn't have the energy to pray anymore. And so I stopped and I said, God, if you're God, you know the reasons why I struggle to pray. And you fathom more than anyone the doubts and the questions and the struggles that I have. So I'm not going to try to fool you and pray. I'm just going to tell you that I can't pray right now. And that's going to be my honest prayer. And so that's a little bit of how I've approached this journey for a while now, in understanding that if God is as massive as we would want a creator, a love that holds us all, however you define that, then the deepest contents of my heart are known. So my prayers now are, help me be awake and alive and aware to what's happening around me, and how can I fill in the gaps that I see in the world. And that gives me agency, and it also allows me to draw upon whatever my faith convictions are to make the world more kind or generous or empathetic. So for sure. Anyone else would love to share anything that, as we're talking, it doesn't have to be on the topic at all, but I just wanted to make sure that you feel.
There's another hand up, John, and the chat is just full of lots of comments too. So maybe we can
Beautiful.
let's
Rolo
go.
Church.
Rolo Church. We don't know what your maybe real name is. But.
Sorry, my name is David. I went to a Union seminary out in New York, kind of like the New York version of Chicago, theological. And, we were very much taught, by James Cone and liberation theology, and Jesus primarily being a prophet. And then I go out to serve a middle of the road to conservative church out in New Jersey, and I preach all the things I'm learning in seminary. And then I have 3 people walk out in my first sermon. And half of me was like, yeah, that's damn right. That's what happens to the prophets. And the other part of me, as a young 20-something, was going, you're a bit selfish here. Your role was to be there and take those people on a spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. Fast forward about a decade, I become the nonprofit of a director in North Carolina, that's serving undocumented immigrants across the state and the nation, and advocating alongside of them. And at the same time, on a personal level, I found that I didn't want to just limit myself just to activist circles, but to understand, again, where the middle of the road to conservative folks were at. And this continued struggle between Jesus's prophet and Jesus's counselor continued to go. So I recently left and purposefully went to a very, very small country church way out in Western Illinois. Got there on an interview. There was a flag out front saying Trump 2024, F your feelings, in the parsonage owned by a congregant at the time. And so it was definitely, but I found a sense of call to say, what does it take to meet those folks where they're at, understand them, be there for their funerals, be there through their divorces and their deaths, gain some of that trust, and then maybe they're willing to go on that heart and mind journey, because people don't just get woke like they do in A Christmas Carol, and where Scrooge wakes up the next morning and they're good to go. It takes years worth of trust and openness, and yet I feel like we have an activist culture that uses the naming and shaming technique that only further separates these folks out. So you have these two different sides expanding like the universe away from one another, and so few folks do I hear. And when I try to appeal to the activist side saying, we got to meet these folks where they're at, you get called out by saying, no, you're actually supporting an oppressive system. And then it makes you feel increasingly isolated. And so the tension that you're speaking to in the battles, at least for me, between, I think you said Jesus is shepherd and Jesus is, revolutionary or whatever it might be, very much speaks. And I'm living that, and I've lived that for 20 years now. And I just don't quite know how to make peace. And I feel like I'm losing my mind here because I'm getting it from both sides. So I appreciate you listening. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that. And I knew this was going to happen, where I want to spend 10 hours with you all. And in the time that we have, what I would say is, what all ministers, all caregivers begin because we love human beings. And so we're placed in a community, and we love that community, and we want to steward them and live life alongside them. And then there's a place where we can easily become beholden to that very community. And for me, that translated into, writing a sermon and thinking, I know the 4 or 5 people who sit over there who aren't going to like this. And so maybe softening my language. And I knew all the people who are going to be disturbed by what I might share. And so it was always this delicate dance of my true convictions with a presentation of those convictions that was palatable enough to still be received. And so that's a tension that I never understood existed before ministry, the very political nature of being a pastor or minister. And what I did was, I knew after the time that I was there for 10 years, I built up an equity of trust and relational capital. And so I could nudge people in a way that maybe I couldn't 2 or 3 years before that. And I got to a new church and didn't have that, and yet still wanted to be that, that truth speaker, that clear talker, and found, God calling me to leave that church after 5 months. And it came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, you're fired, because I didn't have that relational capital, but really wanted to be that bold truth teller. And one of the things I would share with all of you is I tell people, look for the fears and the false stories in people. Look for the ways that whatever it is in their story that is terrifying them. Because when we're in a debate with someone, but whether it's about politics or theology or whatever it could be, legislation, anything, that other person is always afraid of something. And that fear is driving them to hold a certain position. And what we as empathetic people do is we endeavor to learn what they're afraid of, where the false story is, and give them a better story, not to just change their minds, but to take away their fear. I think that's the gift of the minister of compassion. But you're right in that there's always a tension between my convictions and my relationships. And that's always going to exist there. I'm going to jump down to the chat and just, Brendan says, it makes me physically ill to think how intertwined Christianity has become with empire, given the revolutionary anti-imperialist message of Christ. Yeah, Brendan, one of the things that part of that, that learning about people's fears is understanding their backstory. And I think it's already been spoken to really well, is that we encounter people and we want some sort of instant transformation. And working with students, I realize there's students now who are 40 years old, and they're just coming to me now, telling me they got some stuff connected from when we were together, 20 years ago. And I think there are so many people living a theology based out of fear, but they have been immersed in that for so long that it doesn't even occur to them. So those disconnects that you can see really clearly, they have no idea of. And so what I'm constantly trying to do is give them an alternative understanding of the Christian faith, because they have these lenses now that are shaped over decades. And sometimes I'm arguing with them because I'm really arguing with their idea of God. And I can't compete with that. I'm not going to win an argument with their God. So I've got to figure out, how can I get into their story someplace? But that is one of the things I think for ministers is that incredulity of looking and saying, how have we gotten this so wrong? How has the mission drift been so great? Kim, I'm feeling, all right, who says this? Catherine, I'm feeling folks are pulling back into their shells. So much has been on our plates, even those relatively safe in their day-to-day lives. And the bandwidth thing. Oh yeah, I mean, that is so, Catherine, the work we were doing, the work of empathy and diversity and justice, it was difficult in 2019. And what happened in 2020 was that we had this another layer of trauma and extended urgency that people never get out of. And I talk about it a lot, that, I had a woman say to me, at a tour stop, she said, John, I'm so angry all the time. I hate how angry I am. And I said, well, you are angry, but you're also probably grieving. Have you considered that this might be an act of mourning, not just pure anger? And she said, I never thought about it like that. And she said, I feel like I've lost so much. And I think that is the story of being a minister, a caregiver, a person of compassion right now, is that we're on the front lines of relational fractures that we haven't seen to this scale. And that's going to be the true story going forward of how we do this work, is how we enter into those relationships, because people, normal grief is you lose someone, it's an event. You lose someone one time and you spend your whole life grieving that event. And what we have right now is a recurring grief, right? We wake up in the morning and we're dealing with immigration, or we're dealing with international military conflicts, or we're dealing with a pandemic, and we never get to sit with anything and process it correctly. And so there's just a recurring grief here that is the story of what you actually are called into the trenches of. Yeah.
I would agree with that. A lot of it is unknowingly based in fear. I was reading something the other day that basically said, that if that could happen to them, it can happen to me. And we don't want to acknowledge that. That is one of the, the huge, especially, and we're in a society that most of us, there are way too many people who are not safe, but most people don't realize how safe that they have been, how, what a good shape they're in. And now you've got a pandemic that does not respect monetary, ability to pay for what we love in life, to have a good house over our, a roof over our heads, etc. Even to have good health care, which was, huge. And now we suddenly have, most of us grew up in that, yes, Russia was the Cold War and everything else, but World War II was finally the war. And we ignored a lot of things that were going on globally because too many people didn't look like too many of us. And suddenly now it's real again. And that fear is just, pulling everybody back. But thank you. I appreciate your words on that. And I agree with a lot of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a Catherine, your name was covered by a little thing there. I couldn't see it on my screen.
Yes, sorry, Catherine. Yes.
No, that's okay. No, it wasn't your fault. And I think what we want to do is, there's also a balance. When we talk about being a personal caregiver and status quo changer, is we want to learn the story of people. We want to get into their fears and false stories, but we also don't want to then just allow bigotry and hatred to go unopposed. And that's also, I think, where ministers are on the front lines, is that we're always asked to understand the other, and we want to, and yet we also don't want to perpetuate those systems of bigotry and discrimination. And so I'm always being challenged with that idea. What does it mean to, I think we always want to err on the side of the historically vulnerable, marginalized, oppressed, as we stay open to the stories of people who are afflicted with privilege and who have weaponized religion and all of those things. So it's a balancing act. I did want to touch on something I saw in the chat. Melvin says balancing contemplation and action is difficult. And, Melvin, one of the things, this empathetic, this lifestyle of sustainable compassion, it often requires us to have a self-empathy that I think we don't practice well. Some of my favorite stories in the Gospels about Jesus is that the disciples are looking for Jesus and they can't find him. And the scriptures tell us that he's off to a solitary place praying. And I think there's a two-step dance of engage and withdraw that Jesus models really well, that we don't do all that well. We're usually engaging, and never withdrawing. And whether that looks like silence or solitude or nature or prayer or meditation or rest, I think we have to make sure that we as caregivers don't see that as unnecessary or selfish. It's actually something that sustains us so that we can better do this work. And I think that's why Jesus looks at the crowds. When he gets to the crowds, he has compassion on them, not contempt for them. And the more tired we get, the more we lose focus and the more people become bothersome to us. We feel the weight of that. So anything, it's hard to understand the other when we can't understand ourselves. Thank you, Melvin. Love that. Grieving the loss of white privilege. Melvin, did you want to share a little bit more on that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm working on this tentative problem thesis dealing with caste. Elizabeth Wilkerson does some marvelous work on caste and her work on that, and how that is pretty much what we were all born into. And the underpinnings of caste are white supremacist ideology. And the more we kind of get at that, it's difficult because it's like, hey, I grew up thinking, believing in a white man God that pray the right way, do the right thing, and I can get all these wonderful blessings and all of that. But then when we start really unpacking that and saying that our Constitution is set up by white European landed men. Let me be careful here. And it was not originally intended for 3/5 of the occupants of the land at the time that it was created. And so there's a wonderful book about democracy in chains that blew my mind, that said that there's a movement to separate out democracy and unfettered capitalism. And so there's a book about pastoral care and soul giving and talking about the neoliberal movement, and basically it's a critique of capitalism, and says, so basically the argument is this: we have rights, liberty to gain as much money as we want, unfettered, and there's no need to support the common good. And basically the folks that are driving that and pushing that, unfortunately, it's like Reconstruction.
Yep.
So, oh no, we can't have all these formerly enslaved folks in power and treat them as citizens. Come on, that's not how God intended it.
Right.
We may have lost the war, but so there's a stealth movement that's going on. And so as the demographics of the country are changing, there's a lot of anxiety. So really, during the early 2016 and all of that, I know there was it's economics, but it's really, no, we really can't have a full democracy that looks pluralistic.
Yes.
You can't have a country. So so the current Supreme Court, piece, so they got these white men talking down to this black woman and in a way that's like really like, wow, seriously?
Yeah.
But there's an existential threat. Oh my God, my way of life of being is changing.
Yes.
Oh my God, clutch my pearls. Oh, and it's difficult to talk about the common good when we hold on to the idolatry or the white supremacist ideology. And some of it's conscious, some of it's unconscious.
That's right.
And bringing that to consciousness is very painful.
Yes.
Folks get defensive and yeah.
Melvin, thank you. I know we're getting short on time here, so I wanted to make sure I responded to that. Thank you so much for that, because that is a huge piece of this. Much of my ministry, but many of the ministries represented here, when you encounter opposition, it's because you're encountering people with an alternative story about their own privilege and their own comfort and the ways that they have benefited from the system that's in place. And then when you realize that you're a beneficiary of inequity, there's a resistance to that. And I think that's what we're often experiencing on the front lines of ministry, is a group of people who don't want the real story about their nation or their church. We look at the American church as one of the biggest barriers to equity and justice at many times in our history. And so that's something we have to reckon with as people of faith. And so often we are giving really bad news to people who've been really comfortable with the story they've told themselves. And to someone's point earlier, sometimes you have to be explicit and clear in telling people those things. You can't always talk around it. Sometimes you need to speak with clarity, because that clarity is instructive. I've got people who they'll say to me, John, I'm for family. And I'll say, well, I'm for family too. But then when I dig a little deeper, I see that their idea of family does not include LGBTQ couples or, LGBTQ family members. So we're really not for family in the same way. So we need to have a clarity and specificity as ministers that actually puts that up front and says, let's actually talk about the profound differences we have, and so that we can find some sort of way forward. Issue, how to be prophetic in tiny congregations that can't afford, can't afford to lose members. Preaching must include messages that some people don't want to hear, but they will leave if the pastor doesn't message specifically to them. Okay, yes, John and Jenny. The danger is, when I'll use it like this in the time that we have. I ask people to think about 4 people named Maria. And if I asked you, are all 4 of these people named Maria that you don't know, are they equally of an equal inherent value? And they would say yes. But then I said, well, one of these Marias is actually your Aunt Maria. And one of these Marias is a transgender teenager living in Missouri. And one of these Marias is living on the border of Mexico. And one of these Marias is a mom in the Ukraine. Are all these Marias of the same inherent worth? Well, yes, they are. But what happens is we often cater to our Aunt Maria because we feel obligated to her because of the closeness of the relationship. And what equity work does is it says, I'm going to make sure that the other 3 Marias are represented and are seen as important. And so I will risk losing my Aunt Maria if that relationship is the collateral damage of my authentic voice as a minister, so be it. So yes, we don't want people to leave our churches, but we also want to make sure that we don't cater to the people who are already there and at the expense of people who will never be there unless we represent and invite them through that conversation. Our time just flew by, and I'm just gonna shamelessly ask, if you ever want to have me come back here, I would be so overjoyed to continue our conversation. Here's what I'll tell you in the short time that we have left, is that I value what you do and where you do it, but I value you. And I don't want to see you sacrificing yourselves on the altar of empathetic work. So please make sure that you are honoring your God, you're the God within you, and you're expressing empathy toward yourself so that you can be better able to minister to the harassed and helpless crowds. So I'm just grateful for your time, and thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, John, for being with us today. Thank you, everyone, for an engaging conversation. I wish we had more time. I know there are unanswered questions and comments that we didn't get an opportunity to engage. John, I love that you're willing to come back and join us again. We would absolutely love to have that. So we will make that happen. Friends, those of you who are here for the first time or not usual joiners, please feel free to come back. We meet every Wednesday. Next week, we'll be joined by Reverend Avalon Gaston, who does work in abolitionism and criminal justice reform. It should be an amazing topic. We also each week try to support our students by offering a $10 Starbucks gift certificate. This week's winner goes to Ben Parsons. So Ben, watch your email. Treat yourself to some much needed caffeine at the midpoint of the semester. John, I very much want to thank you for being with us today. I love this idea of thinking about a lifestyle of sustainable compassion in these times. There are so many barriers to that. And as you were speaking, I saw heads nodding and thumbs going up. I know when you're in the speaking role, it's hard to monitor, but what you were saying clearly resonated with so many of us. And there's so much power in having someone just come in and name the realities that we're facing as we go through our lives in whatever form our ministry takes, or our empathy takes, or our compassionate work in the world takes. And so, friends, I hope your spirit is renewed for this work. I know that my spirit is renewed on a weekly basis by these gatherings. And so I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Blessings to you in the coming week. Again, John, thank you. Go in peace, friends.